On the corner of Brook Street in London lies a seemingly ordinary Georgian terrace house. Yet, for those who know its history, it's far from ordinary. This was once the home of Jimi Hendrix, the legendary rock guitarist, during the height of his career in the late 1960s. Today, it is not just a historical site, it's a place of mystery, intrigue, and unease. Hendrix's time in the house was short but pivotal. It's said that within those walls, he composed some of his most iconic pieces. But it's what happens now, decades after his untimely death, that sends shivers down visitors' spines. Staff and guests have reported inexplicable occurrences, especially near the room where Hendrix used to write. Soft, mournful guitar notes drift through the air late at night, even when no one is playing. Lights flicker, and cold drafts sweep through the halls, though the windows are sealed shut. Some claim to have seen fleeting glimpses of a figure tall, with a distinct halo of curly hair standing near the window, gazing out as if lost in thought. The apparition is always silent, fading away before anyone can get too close. One chilling account comes from a former caretaker. Late one evening, while locking up, he heard the unmistakable sound of a guitar strumming. Thinking it was a prank, he went to investigate. In Hendrix's old room, he found an untouched guitar resting on its stand. But the strings were vibrating as if an unseen hand had just played them. Paralyzed with fear, the caretaker watched as the strings continued to hum out a melody, one that felt oddly familiar yet impossible to place. It wasn't until later that he realized the tune matched an unreleased Hendrix track, one that had only been discovered in old recordings years after the guitarist's death. Visitors to the House-Turn Museum often leave with uneasy feelings, but one group had an experience they could never explain. During a private tour, a display case containing one of Hendrix's guitars suddenly shattered. The glass fell outward, as if pushed by an internal force. The tour guide, visibly shaken, insisted nothing like it had ever happened before. One guest, a skeptic at first, swore he felt a hand brush his shoulder just moments before the incident. It was ice cold, he said, and I heard a whisper, something like, "Play it again." Some theorize that Hendrix's spirit lingers, not out of malice but from a deep connection to his music and the life he lived in that house. His energy seems to be tied to his creative process, as though he's still composing, still strumming, still seeking the perfect riff in the afterlife. Paranormal investigators who have spent the night in the house report strange electromagnetic readings around Hendrix's room. Recordings from their sessions capture faint but distinct notes, almost like an otherworldly guitar solo. Whether you believe in ghosts or not, there's no denying the eerie atmosphere of the Jimi Hendrix house. Visitors often leave with goosebumps, feeling as though they've brushed against something or someone not entirely of this world. Perhaps Hendrix's music was so powerful, so deeply embedded in his soul, that even death could not silence it. Or maybe, just maybe, the ghostly figure near the window isn't looking out at London's streets. Perhaps he's watching us, waiting to see who will play the next note in his eternal song. Would you dare to visit? As night deepened over Brook Street, the house grew unnaturally still. The bustling sounds of London faded into the background, replaced by an oppressive silence. It was during these late hours that the house seemed most alive, or perhaps most aware. One evening, a museum curator named Evelyn stayed late to finish cataloging artifacts in the Hendrix room. She had worked in the house for months and thought she had grown immune to its peculiarities. The distant hum of phantom guitar strings, the cold spots that moved like unseen specters, she dismissed these as tricks of her imagination. But that night was different. As she carefully arranged an old amplifier on display, a soft click echoed through the room. The door to the hallway had shut itself. Evelyn frowned. She was sure she'd left it open. She walked over and twisted the knob. It didn't budge. The air in the room seemed to thicken, pressing against her chest. She told herself it was nothing. A draft, perhaps. Yet, as she turned back toward the display, she froze. The amp's power light flickered red, glowing faintly despite the fact that it hadn't been plugged in for years. Then, the sound began, an unmistakable guitar riff, slow and deliberate, as if teasing her. The notes crawled through the air, each one vibrating deep in her bones. It was Hendrix's music, but not a song she recognized. It sounded unfinished, like a melody composed in anguish. Evelyn's rational mind fought to dismiss the growing dread, but the air in the room had turned icy, her breath visible in the dim light. As she scanned the walls for the source of the sound, she noticed something out of place. The framed photograph of Hendrix, which hung proudly above his bed, was askew, and then it moved, tilting slowly, deliberately until it crashed to the floor, the glass shattering into 1,000 jagged pieces. Evelyn gasped, her hand covering her mouth. That's when she saw them. Reflected in the broken shards were figures, shadowy, indistinct, but undeniably human in shape. They stood behind her, silent and still, watching. She spun around, but the room was empty, or so it seemed. Evelyn's terror mounted as the guitar notes grew louder, almost deafening. She clutched her chest, her heartbeat erratic. That's when she heard it, soft, almost imperceptible. But there, a whisper. Play it. Finish it. The voice was hoarse, tinged with desperation. It didn't sound like Hendrix. It sounded older, rougher, as if it came from someone who had been screaming for centuries. Against her will, Evelyn found herself drawn to the guitar resting on its stand in the corner. Her hand trembled as she reached out, compelled by a force she couldn't understand. As her fingers brushed the strings, the sound that erupted was not music but a wail, a mournful, otherworldly cry that shook the walls and made the lights above flicker violently. Evelyn stumbled back, clutching her ears. The guitar fell silent, but something else caught her eye. On the desk where Hendrix had once written his songs, a sheet of paper lay untouched, yellowed with age. She was certain it hadn't been there before. The paper bore musical notations, but they were smeared, almost bleeding into the margins, as if the ink had been applied in a frenzy. The handwriting wasn't Hendrix's. She knew that instantly. It was crude, jagged, and chaotic. Beneath the staff lines, words were scrawled. Only one can finish the song. Only one can free us. Her breath caught as she realized the ink was still wet. Before Evelyn could process what she had seen, the room began to tremble. The amplifier buzzed to life, its knobs spinning wildly on their own. The bed creaked as though someone or something was shifting its weight upon it. And then, the mirror above the dresser fogged over, as though someone had exhaled against it. Slowly, words began to appear in the condensation, written by an unseen hand. "Help me." But as Evelyn stared in mounting horror, the words morphed into something else entirely, their edges darkening as if burned into the glass. "It's too late." The guitar let out a final, discordant screech that echoed through the house, and then all was silent. Evelyn didn't wait to see what would happen next. She fled the house, leaving the door swinging open behind her. To this day, the Hendrix house remains a popular attraction, but visitors are warned not to linger after dark. Some say Evelyn's experience was an isolated event. Others whisper that she wasn't the first to encounter the shadows of Brook Street, and she won't be the last. For in the dead of night, when the streets are silent and the wind barely stirs, the house still breathes. And if you listen closely, you might hear it. The ghostly strumming of a guitar, a melody that yearns to be completed but never will. Perhaps Hendrix's spirit remains tethered to his unfinished work. Or perhaps something far darker resides within the walls, using his memory to lure the living into its grasp. And the question lingers. If you dared to touch the strings, would the music claim you too? Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Evelyn didn't tell anyone what she had experienced, not her colleagues, not the museum directors, not even her closest friends. But she wasn't alone in her silence. Other staff members began leaving cryptic notes in the break room, resignations hastily scrawled on scraps of paper. "I can't work here anymore," one read. "The walls listen." Another simply said, "The music isn't right. It's wrong." Within weeks, whispers spread among the remaining employees. The house was waking up, its restless energy growing stronger. It wasn't until a pair of tourists went missing that the true gravity of the house's darkness came to light. A young couple, drawn to Hendrix's legend, had booked a private nighttime tour, an exclusive experience for those daring enough to explore the house after hours. They never came out. The guide who had escorted them swore they entered the bedroom together. But when she returned moments later, they were gone. The room was empty, save for the guitar. Its strings vibrated faintly, as if touched by unseen fingers. Security footage revealed nothing unusual, only the couple entering the house, smiling and laughing. But when the tape reached the final moments before their disappearance, the screen warped into static. For a brief instant, a shadowy figure could be seen standing by the window, its form tall, distorted, and wrong. Authorities conducted a search, combing every inch of the house and its surrounding streets. They found no trace of the couple. In the wake of the disappearance, the house's operations were briefly suspended. During the downtime, contractors were brought in to inspect the property for structural issues. What they uncovered shocked everyone. Behind a false wall in the kitchen, they discovered a staircase leading to a small, forgotten basement. Dust covered the space, and the air was heavy, almost suffocating. At first glance, the basement appeared unremarkable, just old brick walls and scattered debris. But in the far corner, they found something chilling. An antique reel-to-reel tape recorder sat on a wooden stool, untouched for decades. The tape inside had snapped, but someone or something had scrawled the word "play" across its surface in jagged letters. When the recorder was carefully brought upstairs and repaired, the curators hesitated to play the tape. But curiosity overrode caution. The first few seconds of the recording were filled with static. Then came a voice, deep, gravelly, and uneven, as though the speaker were struggling to form words. "You shouldn't be here." The voice paused, replaced by faint, erratic breathing. And then, a melody began to play, a haunting, distorted riff that grew louder with each passing second. Beneath it, barely audible, was a faint weeping, as if someone trapped within the music itself was crying out for help. The tape abruptly cut off, but not before a final, chilling phrase was whispered. "It's not his house anymore." Following the discovery of the basement, the strange phenomena escalated. Shadows no longer lingered in the corners of rooms, they moved freely, flickering across walls in broad daylight. Visitors reported hearing footsteps behind them, only to turn and find nothing there. One night, a security guard stationed outside the house saw the silhouette of a man standing in the upstairs window. Thinking it was an intruder, he rushed inside, flashlight in hand. But as he climbed the stairs, his radio crackled to life. "Don't go up there," a voice warned. It wasn't one of his colleagues. The guard froze, sweat dripping down his back. The window ahead was wide open, the curtains fluttering in the cold breeze. He slowly stepped into the room, his flashlight trembling. There, on the floor, lay a single handwritten note. The ink was smeared, but the words were clear. "Finish it or join us." The guard never returned to work after that night. Rumors spread that the house itself was cursed, its walls imbued with a darkness older than Hendrix's time there. Some claimed the guitarist had unknowingly tapped into something sinister when he lived in the house, a force that latched onto his genius, twisting it into an eternal prison. Others whispered that the unfinished melody wasn't just a song. It was a key, a ritual, a door. No one knows what would happen if someone dared to play the forbidden notes in full. And perhaps it's better that way. But the house isn't content to wait. The music grows louder, more insistent, and the shadows creep closer. Something stirs in the basement, a presence that hungers for the final note. And the question remains, who will dare to finish Hendrix's last song? Or will the house find someone to play it for him? The answer lies in the growing whispers that haunt Brook Street. The house is calling, and it's only a matter of time before someone answers. Brook Street now carried an unsettling reputation, a place where time seemed to pause as you approached. The air around the house grew heavier, suffocating, as if the street itself wanted to push you away. Yet, the allure of the unknown continued to draw thrill-seekers, musicians, and skeptics alike, some hoping for inspiration, others for proof of the supernatural. Most left shaken, whispering half-formed tales of strange sounds and glimpses of shadowy figures. but a few never left at all. One night, a street busker named Daniel set up outside the house, his battered acoustic guitar slung over his shoulder. He had heard the stories, of course. They were why he had come. Desperate for fame, he thought a night playing on Hendrix's doorstep might draw attention, or even channel a spark of the late legend's brilliance. For hours he strummed, his chords echoing off the quiet facades of neighboring buildings. But as the clock struck midnight, his music faltered. A single, dissonant note rang out, though his fingers hadn't moved. He looked down at his guitar. The strings vibrated on their own, pulling him into a melody he didn't recognize. A slow, haunting progression that twisted and turned, growing darker with every bar. And then the front door of the house creaked open. Daniel's breath caught in his throat. The door shouldn't have moved, it was always locked after dark. He stepped closer, peering into the yawning blackness beyond the threshold. Inside, faint music played, though it wasn't Hendrix's style. It was raw, dissonant, as if an unseen hand were clumsily trying to force the notes into order. A soft whisper drifted from the darkness, "Come inside. Play." Against every instinct screaming for him to run, Daniel crossed the threshold, guitar still in hand. The door slammed shut behind him. The house's interior seemed warped, larger than it should have been. The walls seemed to stretch endlessly, their edges lost in shadow. Daniel's footsteps echoed unnaturally, repeating over and over as though the sound were caught in an endless loop. He followed the music, drawn deeper into the house. Every turn brought him closer to its source, yet the layout defied logic. Corridors folded into themselves, staircases twisted downward only to lead him back to the same hallway. Finally, he found himself in the bedroom, the epicenter of Hendrix's ghostly presence. The guitar stood waiting in the corner, its strings shimmering faintly in the dim light. But Daniel wasn't alone. The walls weren't empty. Dozens of faces stared back at him, photos that hadn't been there in the museum's daytime displays. They weren't all of Hendrix. Some were of nameless figures, their expressions frozen in silent terror. One photo caught his eye. It was Evelyn, the former curator who had disappeared after her haunting encounter. Her face was pale, eyes wide with fear. Beneath her image, a scrawled caption read, "They wouldn't play." Daniel's knees buckled. The whisper returned, louder this time, reverberating around the room. "Finish it." Daniel's hands moved without his control, plucking his guitar strings. The song was already inside him, pulling itself out as though the house had planted it in his mind. Each note he played seemed to come from somewhere else, a place deep and dark and cold. The more he played, the heavier the room became. The faces on the walls shifted, their eyes moving to watch him. Some of them wept, their tears trailing down the cracked plaster. Others began to smile, their lips curling in grotesque satisfaction. Then the shadows began to move. In the farthest corner of the room, where the light refused to reach, a shape emerged. Tall and skeletal, it leaned forward, its head tilted as though listening intently to Daniel's playing. Its fingers, unnaturally long, twitched in time with the melody. When Daniel stopped, unable to continue, the figure straightened. Its voice was low and hollow, reverberating through the room. "You've started. Now finish." Daniel tried to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. The figure extended one spindly hand, pointing to the guitar. Its shadow stretched across the floor, creeping up his body like ink. "You can leave," it said, "but only if the song is whole." Daniel resumed playing, the notes flowing faster now, more desperate. The melody took on a life of its own, twisting into something jagged and discordant. The walls seemed to pulse in rhythm, the faces on them blurring into streaks of black. The figure in the corner began to hum, a deep, resonant sound that rattled Daniel's bones. It grew louder, overwhelming the music, filling his head with an unbearable weight. As the final note approached, the door behind him burst open. A blinding light poured in, and Daniel turned, his fingers slipping from the strings. But when he looked back, the room was empty. The guitar lay silent. The faces were gone. Daniel stumbled out into the street, gasping for air. The house stood quiet behind him, its windows dark. He looked down at his guitar and saw something that made his blood run cold. The strings were broken, but the sound of the song lingered, faint and echoing in his mind. And in the distance, from somewhere deep within the house, the whisper came again. Not enough. Not yet. Daniel staggered out of the house, his heart pounding. The street was empty, the silence around him suffocating. Clutching his guitar, he felt the strings vibrate faintly beneath his fingers, though the instrument was still. He didn't dare look back, but something compelled him to glance at the house one last time. The upstairs window glowed dimly, a faint silhouette standing behind the curtain. A shadow, watching, waiting. Daniel fled, abandoning his dreams of fame. He never played again, haunted by the melody that had wormed its way into his mind. The notes lingered, an endless refrain that kept him awake at night, each repetition pulling him closer to madness. Years later, the house was quietly closed to the public after another disappearance. Locals claimed the music could still be heard if you passed by at the right time, always unfinished, always calling for someone to complete it. No one ever did, and the house remains, silent yet alive, a monument to genius and the darkness it awakened. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story. Any coincidences with real events or characters are accidental.